support beyond capital for LatAm entrepreneurs and thinking about the VC's role within the broader ecosystem to enable long-term change instead of sort of making bets on an existing pool of opportunities.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the LatAm Venture Capital Podcast. This is your host, Fernanda Sesto, and in this show, I have thought-provoking interviews with Latinx venture capital investors and fearless entrepreneurs who share their stories of success, challenges, career backgrounds, and market thoughts. Thank you for tuning in today, and I'm excited to introduce today's guest. Cristian Raygoza is the head of startups and VC at Clara, the leading Latin American solution for businesses to make and manage all their payments, with a presence in Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. He's also managing partner of Iluminar Ventures, which invests in early-stage startups in Spanish-speaking LatAm, and he's also on the board of TrueColors LatAm, a new nonprofit advocating for LGBTQ representation in the Latin American tech ecosystem. Cristian is Mexican-American and is originally from Los Angeles, California, and he received his BA in economics from the University of Chicago. In today's episode, we talk about the importance of building ecosystems in Latin America, how regulations and governments play a role in innovation development, and the different projects Cristian is currently working on and how they supplement each other. This is Cristian Raygoza. Hi, Cristian. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me on. Very excited to be on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. So let's kick off with what's your story, what's your passion, and what drives you?
Thank you for asking. So what's my story? Just I guess for the headline. So I'm currently talking to you from the offices of Clara in Mexico City. At Clara, I am the company's global head of startups and VC, which is a newer role that I started about 3 months ago now, and happened sort of as a consequence of knowing the folks at Clara for quite some time, being an investor in the company through Angels fund that I used to work at, and seeing an opportunity to continue to help the startups community tackle some of its biggest problems through the Clara lens. I also run a venture firm called Iluminar, which has been around for about 2 years. We invest at early stage in Spanish-speaking Latin America. I see the two sort of roles as highly synergistic. The difference is one is an investing role, and one is really, I think, an enablement role in a different way. Iluminar started 2 years ago as a spin-out from a much larger fund called Angels, where I was an early employee. I was number 8. I originally came in as chief of staff from the co-founders, and was just really excited by that organization's mission to really enable LGBTQ inclusion in the global tech ecosystem. I saw them grow from $20 million a year in investments to almost $1 billion a year when I sort of stepped back to focus just on LatAm through Iluminar. And Iluminar has made about 35 investments in the region. About half of them have main operations in Mexico, a quarter in Colombia. The rest are Chile, Argentina, Peru, and a number of those also have operations in Brazil. And I run the firm with my partner, Victoria, who is a dear friend. She's been with me from the start and is also extremely passionate about helping entrepreneurs kind of get the resources and access to talent, capital, insights. She spent the last 10 years in the Mexican VC ecosystem on both operating roles in sort of people and culture and ops, and was an operating partner at a fintech fund in Mexico City prior to joining Iluminar. A little more just about my broad background. So I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm Mexican-American. My mom's side is from Mexico City. My dad's side is from Jalisco. I am pretty gringo, born and raised in LA, and my Spanish is, somewhere between intermediate and professional. It's getting there. I wish it were better. It's the classic second generation Latino problem. And studied economics at the University of Chicago. Started my career working in the institutional investing space in New York at AIG's asset management platform, which was the $360 billion portfolio. I was primarily focused, I was an associate portfolio manager for our $60 billion investment grade corporate credit book, and then moved up to the chief investment officer's office and helped tactically oversee our strategy across the entire portfolio, which included real estate, private markets, way more esoteric sort of debt instruments. It was a truly global portfolio. And so it was a really valuable investing experience that I was lucky to have before focusing on entrepreneurship. And I would say, sorry, I know I've been talking a while, but I would say, what's kind of been a through line and what's driven me, I think, from starting in the kind of traditional investing space and got me to where I am today, and has been kind of a strong desire to make an impact in terms of representation of folks who historically have been left out of some of these very important spaces. So I ended up partly at that big institutional investor because I was able to meet them through a wonderful organization that I'm still involved with today called Out for Undergrad, which focuses on bringing LGBTQ undergraduates to great companies in finance and consulting and professional services. When I was in New York at the asset manager, my first entryway into the entrepreneurial community was through organizations at the intersection of the LGBTQ identity and sort of business and entrepreneurship, organizations like Out in Tech, Start Out, and eventually Angels, as mentioned. And that continues to be a major sort of source of inspiration for me when I think about sort of underrepresented folks in a broader sense, and the way that I'm building Iluminar, and the way that I'm also building TrueColors, which is sort of the third thing that keeps me very, very busy. It is a nonprofit that was recently started alongside 5 other LGBTQ tech leaders in LatAm to promote kind of inclusion and representation and advocate for best practices within the corporate and tech settings across the region. And so, I think TrueColors and also my role at Clara, all of it is a continuation of this sort of desire to help ensure that folks who are very talented and have a lot to say and a lot to do are empowered to make the change that they want to see.
Wow, I love that. I love your story and that you are connecting, those ideas of helping entrepreneurs, but also the inclusivity and diversity part. I'm also feel like that as well with women specifically and bringing more representation. So I really admire that. And so this is a personal question, but I like to ask, what's the one thing you would tell your younger self?
It's a good question. And something I've been thinking about weirdly, like more lately, because sometimes it can be quite overwhelming with just the quantity of work that there is to be done, right? And it's like, I think I can get really caught up in the like, what is the next thing that I need to do in order to make the impact that I want to see? And I think it's sometimes hard to step back and say oh yeah, I've actually like kind of done a lot in a fairly short amount of time. And I think my younger self, who would be very, very proud to see the way that I've spun this little web of crazy things that I really care about. I think younger self was way less certain and secure about his vision for making change in the world. I think he was really hungry for doing something excellent and of importance, and probably felt a little bit of doubt in his ability to do that, especially taking into consideration the fact that, when I was much younger, I wasn't out, and there was all this fear of like, I think what I wanted and knew what I was, and my ability to kind of authentically express that. And I think that if I could go back to my younger self with the knowledge and the experience that I have today, I would tell him, screw it, like just be who you want to be. Don't worry about what other people will think, because more often than not, and not always, and I was a bit lucky in this regard, like most people will be very supportive of you and want to see you succeed and really want you to be happy. And so, I think there would probably have been a lot of saved um, uh, anxiety and frustration in having been more willing to kind of authentically take risks that maybe at that time I was more afraid of taking. And obviously now in my role today, all I do is take smart risks and help other people do the same. So I think I've learned a lot since I
Mhm.
was younger self.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And also gaining confidence, I think, comes with age as well. Confidence in yourself and what you believe in. So it seems like you've done or achieved that as well. So now moving on to like your role in the VC world, I heard a couple of podcasts and read some blogs that you wrote, and you mentioned that the value add of Iluminar, what it brings to the portfolio companies beyond the capital, and you emphasize the importance of building a strong ecosystem in Latin America with the support of universities and the government. And I thought that was really interesting because it's not just seeing Iluminar as a one player, but also, overall a community and ecosystem. So I'm curious to know, how do you think portfolio support looks like in LatAm? And specifically, what are the current obstacles that you see startups experience after they raise capital?
Yeah, so happy to dive into that. And I think I can sometimes, I don't know if the listeners necessarily will be super familiar with like Bernie Sanders, but sometimes I think of myself a bit like him, and that I have a very occasionally repetitive but consistent message around what I think my priorities are in terms of helping enable smart risk taking and entrepreneurship within the LatAm region. I think um, the balance that or the tension that I'm consistently kind of trying to solve is this, um, how can I think about things more expansively while staying practical in my ability to execute a strategy? Um, and I think that's a tension that many people feel. But I think a tendency that is starting to change, but at least at the beginning periods of time in the LatAm ecosystem, the tendency for venture firms was to think of themselves as capital providers first and foremost, which is still obviously, I think, a core function of a venture capital firm. It's to, identify talented founders and set the right price, provide them with capital to build something amazing, right? And you have to be really disciplined about that. And that's like a non-negotiable component of being a venture capitalist. But what I think, looking at both the US perspective of venture and what I have experienced in LatAm, sometimes what can be lacking, I think, is, support beyond the capital for LatAm entrepreneurs, and thinking about kind of the VC's role within the broader ecosystem to enable long-term change instead of sort of making bets on an existing pool of opportunities. And where I still see a huge opportunity to make a difference, there are a few different spaces. So as mentioned, I think education is one of them. When I think about the infrastructure built in the United States for servicing sort of the tech kind of opportunity, universities, private and public, in that context, do a really great job of aligning incentives and interests with the needs of the private sector, established and small. And startups and tech companies are pretty well represented, especially at some of the really shiny schools, the Berkeleys, the Stanfords, the whatevers. And I haven't yet seen the type of concerted effort from the university sector in places like Mexico or Colombia or even Brazil in kind of integrating educational needs with opportunities in the tech sector. And I think that kind of creates a little bit of a bottleneck in terms of what we can fund in the future and how quickly we can develop this sort of startup skill set and knowledge base, in the ecosystem. To put it very, very specifically, and this is something I probably said on another podcast, like if you're someone who's studying computer science at Berkeley, you have a very clear cultural understanding of what tech is. You probably applied to Berkeley as a CS major because you wanted to work at some tech company or a startup. So the cultural understanding is pretty ingrained within that world. The curriculum is sort of up to speed with what the needs of the private sector are. The Googles and the Facebooks and the sort of big tech companies and smaller startups come to campus and kind of tell you about the opportunity. They have internship programs. They have, sort of clearly articulated recruiting strategies that source from these universities. And then, a computer science major does an internship, they join full time. Maybe they do that for like 2 or 3 years, and then they're like, I'm tired of the big corporate bureaucracy that is Google. I'm going to go join some Series A startup or something, or start my own company. And I think we're still in the development phase of creating that kind of infrastructure. I don't think that it's something that a venture firm like Iluminar can do alone. And again, coming back to this like expansiveness of ecosystem building and trying to balance kind of resources against vision. What I try to do with Iluminar is be someone who can help align those interests, and do so in a very collaborative way. So I spent time talking with folks in, say, Mexican government around like, what are some of the thoughts that I have related to innovation strategy and how we can kind of reduce the cost to develop new technologies in the region. And there are a bunch of different conversations that I've had with folks in like the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores or Ministry of Economy. And I think there's not necessarily enough of that happening yet between sort of folks in the private sector in innovation and government, and the same thing with universities. And so I think like I am trying to do what I can to encourage folks in government to be a little more proactive and extend an olive branch to, I think, folks on the capital providing side who maybe feel a certain kind of uncertainty or risk to getting involved with government. But I think that the path forward to improving quality of innovation is by creating a more integrated infrastructure, which aligns sort of government understanding and policy initiatives with what is happening on the ground in the entrepreneurial sector, which ideally folks in the venture capital space can do more here to communicate more proactively with decision makers in government, to mitigate risk and to create, I think, smarter, more informed views within local governments, and then do more work with the university sector. I think one of the problems in Latin America is like everyone is afraid of bureaucracy. That's part of the beautiful opportunity here, is like there's so much inefficiency in the system that like tech solutions can really kind of change that. But I think it's a little short-sighted to just focus on trying to pick the winner in a smaller kind of pool of opportunity versus trying to create new winners and then being that source of capital to sort of give to them as the size of the potential investable opportunity grows, if that makes sense. So just to kind of tie up, I went on a big sort of conversation around like the education piece, but that's one thing, right? So we try to work with government, we try to work with and think tanks and nonprofits that like do this kind of forward-thinking advocacy for the innovation sector. We do work. We're trying to do more work with the university players in the region. We do a lot of collaboration with other VCs, both in LatAm and across the border, because we think that we want to have consistent availability of capital, and we want to be a real champion of kind of folks who are building locally in LatAm and bringing that access to really great established VC brands in the US as well. And we want to help with kind of, again, the representation piece too, because we think that's really important as the ecosystem continues to develop, that it's not just, the usual suspects who are maybe willing to take the risk more because they come from certain sort of socioeconomic backgrounds, but that it's, it's women, it's LGBTQ folks, it's, folks who are not white or from really privileged backgrounds. And I think we're at the very early parts of building that into the ecosystem, and there's a lot of work to do, and we're really excited to do it.
Yeah, I personally agree with your vision of venture capital, or like a venture capital firm being part of that forward thinking, as you said it, and just being part of a community that is trying to, at the end of the day, especially in LatAm, I think, where there's so many inefficiencies, there's also so many basic needs that are still not covered. And tech companies and overall entrepreneurs have a lot of opportunities there to make a great impact. And partnering with institutions like the government or university can really help the quality of lives of Latin Americans. And I personally care about that too. So I like, hearing more about this, of seeing how VCs can play a role in that movement. And, talking about the different countries that we have in LATAM and like how the ecosystem players change as well. I'm curious to know, how do you as a Latin American investor manage the diversity of regulations and incentives and this, difference in players overall when it comes to being an active partner to startups that you invest in?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question. As mentioned earlier in the podcast, I think a very large percentage of the portfolio is Mexico and Colombia. I think this is a conversation actually that I've had with some potential LPs in the past, in terms of like, from a inclusion perspective, does it make sense to be investing a lot more in what I would say are like, and I mean this in a polite way, like adjacent or non-core LatAm markets, right? I think that's a question where Iluminar historically has maintained an open mind to investing outside of the big, sexy Mexico, Colombia, Brazil markets, because there is definitely opportunity waiting to be capitalized in smaller geographies. And a number of the companies in our portfolio, even if they start in Mexico or Colombia, at times will expand to other markets like Peru or Costa Rica, or places where I think it is a little more challenging, there's more fragmentation in terms of like knowledge and awareness of how to navigate the local regulatory regimes in those places, right? And I think part of the problem, so in talking to one of these LPs that I'm thinking of, right, they were like, well, one of our best investments has been in Ecuador, or one of our best investments has been, in the Caribbean somewhere. And we were able to get a really good outcome because no one else was willing to capitalize it at the stage that we invested. And, there's real talent there and not enough kind of folks being capital providers. I think that's like a really strong point, but where I get worried around that, well, one, what I end up seeing, especially with like, a couple of the folks I'm thinking of that have come from some of those smaller markets, is they end up typically, trying to build in Mexico or Brazil or Colombia, out of kind of this necessity of like the market size, right? And so for us, I think we have quite a bit of comfort and familiarity with those three large markets. They have a now kind of established playbook and framework of kind of building businesses in those countries. And we are open to considering opportunities that are outside of those core markets where we think there's like total potential to expand across the region and capture a large opportunity that exists not just in the smaller market. I think of Chile as an example, right? Where it's like, I think there's a lot of really interesting talent in Chile. There's a very long history of the government being quite supportive in terms of fostering the innovation economy there. But the truth is, it's a pretty small country, right? And so, for our investments there, I think almost pretty universally, it's a place that they're familiar with, where they can capture an opportunity in the short term, and then they generally go to bigger markets. And I think that there's not necessarily, I think in the short term, it is harder to be someone building a business in a smaller market and trying to solicit capital from investors in those places. I think in the long term, what I also see is a number of folks from smaller markets actually coming to places like Mexico City or Medellin or Sao Paulo and like finding easier access to talent or capital by coming to those places and kind of building in a more expansive way. And I think that sort of, given that that's where we're at in terms of the ecosystem development and the sort of risk tolerance in general, over time, I think there will be knowledge spillovers that will make it easier for folks in smaller markets to kind of, build local solutions, having kind of been in these dense markets that are a little more, what's the word I'm looking for? Developed. And I think about it in the same way as the US. It's like a lot of folks get funded in San Francisco, a lot of folks get funded in New York. I don't think that that's necessarily inherently a bad thing. I think like these networks of knowledge and playbooks exist. And if you're someone building in like a smaller, less VC oriented kind of a state in the US, the tendency is to go to one of these bigger places to attract talent and capital more easily. It's not a necessity. I think it's just, and I've seen people build really great companies in the US context in non-core VC US markets. I think it's just a question of what is the market size and how are you either constrained or given a special advantage by being in the setting that is not the core setting.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I like that comparison of the US markets, definitely the capital and the opportunities, but also the amount of startups that come out of the, California and New York. It's incomparable with like the Midwest, for example, and how that translates in a way into Latin America as well. And there's decentralized markets. It's just interesting to see though how the smaller markets, like my country, for example, Uruguay, are trying to copy or just adopt the policies and regulations that have helped these other countries like Brazil, and how that would look like in the future. And if we can recognize certain patterns that will make these markets better in the future. I love to see Uruguay being it's such a small country, so I don't know how it will look like, but we do have a unicorn there, do local. I don't know if you heard of it, but yeah. So we'll see. I just think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah. And I think Uruguay is a kind of a leader in terms of the country's willingness to kind of do policy innovation and be forward thinking in terms of how they can attract capital and be flexible in terms of their ability to support local entrepreneurs in building what they want to build. I think like it's this balance between the size of the market is the size of the market, and it's probably the case that like a company building in Uruguay will necessarily have to build outside of Uruguay as well. Mm-hmm. But I think there are really interesting ways that LatAm governments can kind of adapt policies that make it easier to start a business, that maybe are like tax preferable, that support the growth of local talent generation. And, obviously as folks like dLocal become major players, there's a sort of spillover effect from that as well. So I think it's really just a matter of time before kind of, I don't like to think of the opportunity in LatAm as just a Mexico or Colombia or Brazil type of a thing. I do think it is region wide. But I also am practical and understanding that like there is some value to dense networks of talent, capital, and people willing to take risks. And I think there should be some kind of collaboration and alignment between governments and overarchingly trying to capitalize great opportunities that can be helpful across the region as opposed to just being kind of maybe not short-sighted, but navel gazing in their
Yeah.
bubble is the way to put it.
Yeah, no, thank you. So now I'm curious to learn more about your role at Clara and like how you ended up there. So you shared before that you wanted to get your hands dirty in the ecosystem. Now you're the head of startups in Clara, and it's which is an end-to-end payment platform for companies in Latin America. So can you just share more about this role and your thought process before making the decision to join Clara?
Yeah, of course. Love Clara. Again, I've known the company for quite some time. I've known Jerry for quite some time. He's been a really great advocate of some of the LGBTQ focused initiatives that I've helped put together, and more broadly in the community. Um, and really, I think the question of joining Clara was around the opportunity to continue to make an impact, and enable entrepreneurs to um, build and manage what they're building much more easily, um, and helping accelerate that mission by tapping into kind of what I've built with my network and with the way that I think about the ecosystem in Latin America. So the title is Global Head of Startups, VC, and Private Equity, which is a very long title. And I think the core point of it is really helping make sure that as Clara continues to grow, and as the LatAm tech ecosystem continues to grow, that we are really doing what we can to make sure that startups of all sizes can reduce the burden of these sort of complicated, annoying problems related to managing and controlling corporate spend and the way that their finance function works, right? We've created a solution that makes it very easy for folks to kind of consolidate that information around monthly or annual spend, in a sort of seamless and kind of cards enabled way, with many other exciting things to come, right? And so the opportunity to join was really, I think, a combination of my desire to kind of more practically find ways to, as with all the other things I've described, reduce the cost to build a business for folks who are building in Latin America. And I think, I have a really unique background that enables me to kind of accelerate Clara's mission to do that.
I'm just like curious, like, so when you decided to join, like what was the moment like that triggered that decision? Like if you can just share, because I think, and also how does your experience as an investor help you in your role or like making this decision specifically? I think it's interesting that you're serving on both roles right now and how you have to switch between the roles and the mindsets. I'm sure like that also, I mean, probably has an effect on it.
Yeah, so I think, look, I mean, I think for a company like Clara, to be able to access the startup community and the venture community in a sort of systematic way can be a bit challenging, right? Like I think the startups world is a bit of a bubble of its own, and accessing that bubble, I think, requires a specific kind of network. And so, what am I kind of doing in these first 3 months that I've been at Clara? I mean, obviously, it's like, how can I make sure that folks in Colombia or Brazil or Mexico really know us and trust us, and that we're very actively kind of making sure that they know how to use our solution and sort of optimally leverage it in the variety of ways that it can be used. And so I think coming to the question of like, how do you kind of manage the Iluminar and Clara all at once thing? And let's not forget TrueColors. Like again, 3 hats at once is quite a lot. But there's a ton of overlap in terms of who I'm talking to and like the strategy, right? So on the Iluminar side, like what am I doing? I am have really great relationships with all the major LatAm and US VC firms that invest in LatAm. I am talking to entrepreneurs all the time and trying to understand like what their problems are and how it can be helpful. On the TrueColor side, it's just a slightly different demographic, but similar type of thing. How can I, build community within the LGBTQ sort of set of folks in LatAm tech, and kind of help them get better access, and understanding of how to navigate being an entrepreneur while also being LGBTQ. And in Clara, it's like that community and those networks that I've built in those two other contexts have very strong overlap with the sort of quality of service and types of partnerships that I'm building at Clara. So to me, it's all very much one thing. I get to meet incredible companies that maybe weren't on my radar through the vehicle of Clara, and vice versa. Clara gets to meet really incredible startups that weren't customers through the I think pretty awesome vehicle that I've built through Iluminar. So it's all highly synergistic, and I think aligns with my ecosystem building mindset. And I think in terms of the in one case, I think there's a lot more of this kind of rigorous analytical investment opportunity assessment. And there's a strategy to kind of build a platform that entrepreneurs trust and entrepreneurs want to come to for capital and investment, and that's Iluminar. And I'm very much building something very similar within Clara. It's almost like building a startup within a startup for startups. It's actually how we kind of pitched at the beginning. Is like, what I'm building at Clara is a strategy to make sure that we are the trusted partner for startups in the markets that we serve, and kind of in a comprehensive way, leveraging our products as obviously the way that we grow and make money, but not just exclusively that. Thinking about how we can be real partners to startups, beyond kind of being a spend management tool, and that means providing opportunities for folks who use our product and who might use our product to meet with really interesting corporate innovation partners, or hosting events around diversity and inclusion related themes, or just having really I think something that I bring to the table to Clara as well is the opportunity to not just be someone who is ultimately trying to get startups to use our product, which is a great product that they should be using, but also see me as an ally, and Clara as an ally in helping them solve many of their other problems as entrepreneurs, via our partnerships, via my ability to help them get in touch with really amazing capital, etc. It's an extension of what I'm already doing, just in a more operational way.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I totally get it, and resonate with that as well, with like the different projects I'm involved as well. So how like people ask me, how do you do all that? And it's like, well, things are just transferable in a way. Like the skills I'm using are the same. It's just maybe the context switching that's the harder part. So now the final question, this podcast targeted towards outside investors trying to learn more about investing in Latin America. So what is a piece of advice that you would give them?
Within the Latin American framework, or rather ecosystem specifically. So I think one thing that I don't know if this is advice, but it's something that I kind of experienced in building Iluminar as an investment platform, is there's kind of this interesting problem in Latin America today where there's still kind of risk aversion from local capital in sort of being partners to new funds and players in the region, and the kind of skepticism around the value that sort of innovation within the region can bring. And I would say there's also risk aversion in the US context from folks who could be capital providers, meaning LPs in funds focused on LatAm, because there's sort of this sense of like LatAm is interesting. I don't know if I am an expert at this. It's not really my wheelhouse. I think that on both sides, and again, this I think aligns very much with my ecosystem building mindset. There is a little bit of this laziness in terms of being able to do the homework on like the immense value creation opportunities and fundamental needs in Latin America. I think it's very easy for an LP in the US or in LatAm to say, oh, I like US is big, it's mature, like I know it well, I'm going to put more money into that. Or in the LatAm context, to be like, yeah, I have this family office, we have a big operating business, we know how to do that well. We have probably a huge tilt toward real estate and we like doing real estate. And there's this, I think, kind of emergent engagement with the opportunity, but something that doesn't feel necessarily super concerted. And I think that for the ecosystem to continue to thrive and grow, we'd have more champions kind of helping to educate sophisticated, powerful folks on both sides of the border to really understand what is going on in Latin America and take that additional risk, because I think taking that risk will pay off in the long run. In seeing how the tides of geopolitics are shifting, the nearshoring opportunity is growing, the level of just talent available in the region. I was talking to a corporate in the US, a very large financial player that's looking to open, an office that could scale to 1,000 people in Mexico soon. There's a clear trend that is up and to the right in terms of investment in places like Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and an increased level of sophistication. And I think just given where I think the macro has gone recently and where rates have gone and where there's this kind of tendency to say, I'm going to go back to what I know as an LP, which often means I'm going to invest more in US venture because it's the thing that is the most built out. I think that's actually a short-sighted approach to developing real alpha. And I think smart LPs will be able to identify that Latin America is really on a different path and has a really unique moment where additional capital given to folks with deep expertise and understanding of the nuances in the region will really be able to make an enormous impact in the coming years. And so my hope is for the region that, one, I think that capital that is already investing is largely here to stay in a lot of ways. I think there's been some fear of like US funds kind of retreating. I haven't necessarily seen that happening as much. I think there are a lot of folks who are still very much willing to look at Latin America on the VC side, who are historically much more US focused. And I, again, am continuing to do a lot of work on ensuring that those folks continue to invest here by keeping those relationships warm. But I think amidst all the noise of the market, having conviction and really doing your homework is super important. And so I think that's my advice is do your homework. I think that that's what really makes the difference when you're in sort of a chaotic market. The folks who are doing the most work to stay the most informed and really be innovative in terms of the way that they build their businesses, they allocate their money, they think about policy and not just kind of sticking to the status quo, which is comfortable and knowable. That's where the real value creation happens. And so that's what I encourage folks to do, is to really do their homework.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cristian. That was great advice. I'm sure the audience will appreciate it. Thank you for being in the podcast. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed my time.
Asking good questions takes a lot of preparation and research beforehand. And in this particular scenario, I wanted to dig deeper into Cristian's thoughts of Latin America portfolio support and the way he sees venture capital firms being an active player into the ecosystem and also improving the quality of lives of thousands of people through innovation and through investments. And I really learned a lot about it, and it got me questioning the impact that VC firms can have in emerging markets like Latin America. I hope you learned something new today. Please make sure to share this episode on your network and come back next week for a new episode.